The United States Federal Reserve is considering the creation of a digital dollar.
I told you it was coming. I said they'd go for central bank digital currencies.
When the centralized media conglomerate is talking about CBDCs, you know they have a plan in place already to enroll it out. And in this episode today, I think I figured out how they're gonna roll out the United States CBDC, and it's not by who you think. It's not gonna be by the Federal Reserve, because they already have the FedNow system. That's a payment network. That's not a CBDC. The payment network is like a SWIFT system, right? You have a SWIFT code or a routing number from one bank to another. That's just the rails. But the actual train, the cars on the rails are the CBDCs, is the centralized banking digital dollars. These digital dollars, this digital currency, I find will actually be, well, before we get right into that, you've joined us here at the Financial Almanac. I'm Basil. Let's get right into who's going to be making the CBDCs here in the States. The thing with a CBDC, a centralized bank digital currency, is it's centralized, meaning it might lead to communism because central planning never works out too well, especially when you have too much force and they're very tyrannical or authoritarian or oligarchy. Oh my God, it's just nice. My history will show us that it's awful for the masses. The people go hungry when they have central planners, centralized currencies. Funny enough, by the end of this show, I'll also share with you the first time CBDCs, or in the spirit of that CBDC, was first made. And here's a hint, it happened over 100 years ago, where the first CBDC, or the backbone of a CBDC, was enforced into a real world in 1922. But before I get into that, let's get back to centralized digital banking currencies. So who will make this CBDC? If it's not going to be the central bank, like I said, then who do I suspect? Well, let's look at the railings first, right? The central bank, the Federal Reserve, is like the head honcho of the global financial central banks. It's the main quarterback, right? And who owns this Federal Reserve? Let's have a look at that. Well, it's owned by 12 member banks, right? 12 separate regional Federal Reserves spread out across the states. So there are 12 Federal Reserve banks, and the prom king, the head quarterback, right, for all of these 12 is the New York Federal Reserve, as you probably already guessed. But did you know that each one of the 12 actually operates separately than the other? Yes, even though there's a lot of overlap, like a franchise, right? The operations internally are separated from each other. But not only that, the region it governs, those banks in that region actually own the Federal Reserve, right? So there's 12 of them, and each one of those have, their own region that they're controlling, and those banks in each of those regions have to be a part owner of that, Federal Reserve Bank, and that is operated separately, like the 12 disciples, right, to Washington, D.C. Washington doesn't actually own the Federal Reserve. It's a partnership because of what happened with Congress in 1913 and, the meeting that took place on Jekyll Island. After signing the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, Woodrow Wilson in 1919 even regrets his decision. He states, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." Explain quickly how it's structured with their 12 member banks and how each is operated separately and each one is owned separately by their member banks in those regions is because if we think of, like, hypothetically, let's simplify this idea. Let's consider the prom king, right? The quarterback, the New York Federal Reserve. Now, if the New York Federal Reserve took all those banks, let's simplify those banks. Let's get rid of a bunch of them, and let's just say there's 3 major banks in there, right? Let's say the New York Fed only governs JP Morgan, Citibank, and Goldman Sachs, right? Let's say Goldman Sachs owns 20%, Citibank owns 20%, and that would leave JP Morgan with 60%. Now, depending on the size, JP Morgan being the biggest out of them, they own 60% because they acquired, some other banks, we'll say like First Republic and whatever the future holds, that they might, gobble up as well. But not only that, we see 20% is held by Citi, so they're also a really large company that will probably gobble up some, collapsing crisis bank that come through in the future, and also say Goldman Sachs as well, right? Everyone gets to eat today. God forbid. But let's say that's how it's structured, right? The New York Fed, actually, let me show you something online real quick.
So we here at the Board of Governors for the Federal Reserve System is the Federal Reserve's website. They have frequently asked questions. Who owns the Federal Reserve is a common question they get. They'll tell you in their answer, the Federal Reserve System is not owned by anyone. Oh, really? Maybe not by one, but maybe by every bank, all commercial banks. Let's see why I say that. Right? And usually they don't own anything, they like to control things. So who controls the Federal Reserve? If you know a little bit about trust law, you know exactly what I mean. Over here, later on in their answer, they'll tell you, for instance, each of the 12 reserve banks, right, operates within its own particular geographic area or district of the United States. Also, there's 12 reserve banks that operate with their own, okay, I remember saying that, and each is separately incorporated. Wait, incorporated? Doesn't that mean there's articles of incorporation, right? That means a human with a belly button had to incorporate with articles of incorporation. They had to register that. And its own board of directors. Okay, so we know a human definitely incorporated it, but maybe they just control the assets and they don't own the assets, because owning means you own the liabilities. And we know the FDIC comes in, have the taxpayer, pay for the liabilities of this trust, and the controllers, right, and this trust get to keep all the assets, right? That's how they control in this trust. Separately incorporated. So all 12 were separately incorporated. There's 12 articles of incorporation out there, and they have their board of directors. Commercial banks like JP Morgan, Citi, Goldman Sachs, that are members of the Federal Reserve, yes they are, hold stock in their district's reserve bank. They hold stock. Stockholders are shareholders. Stockholders, they actually have ownership of that bank. The equity is there. The commercial banks hold equity to the Federal Reserve, their district Federal Reserve Bank. However, owning a Federal Reserve Bank is quite different from owning stock in a private company, you foolish person, because they get bailed out by the taxpayer, and your understanding of private companies don't have that kind of privilege, right? The Federal Reserve banks are not operated for profit. Basil, what are you talking about? They clearly say they're not operating for profit. Well, yes, it might be a non-profit, but the ownership of a certain amount of stock is by law a condition of membership in the system. So you're telling me these commercial banks that are members of the Federal Reserve have to hold stock, meaning they have to be holders of their district's reserve, and it's by law they have to pay their condition of a membership. In fact, the Federal Reserve banks are required by law to transfer net earnings to the U.S. Treasury, that's Janet Yellen, after providing for all necessary expenses of their Federal Reserve banks. Okay, so they don't really tell you what all necessary expenses of the Federal Reserve banks are. It could be everything from, hey, we're a non-profit organization, but we're gonna fly to Davos in our jet, drinking $1,000 glass of orange juice and have Wagyu, AAA, quadruple A beef. And yeah, this is all just part of the necessary expenses. But yeah, we're not for profit at all. Don't worry about us. Just look over there, right? And guess what? These commercial banks are legally required to receive dividend payments because they're stockholders. The Federal Reserve banks legally require dividend payments to be paid out and maintain a limited balance on their surplus fund. What's a limited balance of infinity, of quantitative easing? What's a fraction of infinity? Isn't it still infinity? Oh yeah. We see why the national debt keeps rising. Thank you very much. Legally required to pay dividends. So there's a membership fee involved, and you're required to own stock, right? These commercial banks have to own stock in the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve legally requires them to be paying dividends. That's like me going to the gym, being a member, and then the gym pays me to show up. Clearly, I'm not a customer or client, I'm an owner. And they're telling me there's nobody that owns the Federal Reserve. We see that there is stock held by commercial banks, and it's a requirement of ownership of a certain amount of stock. That is by law, a condition of membership into their system. That we use the word ownership here, and then over here it's not owned because it's not by anyone, it's by a conglomerate. So clearly, we see the Federal Reserve System is owned by commercial banks. And who's the king of all commercial banks? JP Morgan.
So we see no matter how much like Frankensteinian, Kool-Aid logic these guys are trying to push on us, the mainstream media, Federal Reserve, and politicians, we know because of just day-to-day regular common consensus in our society, whoever owns the shares owns a part of that business. Whoever owns the most amount of shares will own the most amount of Federal Reserve. That means the biggest banks own the biggest shares of the Fed. And I'm sure it's not a surprise that the biggest owner, because of the biggest bank, is JP Morgan. If you guys think your portfolio is doing good because you've invested a little in semiconductors and AI with NVIDIA in them, guess what? The best trade of the 21st century was when JP Morgan came to save and rescue First Republic Bank. With the FDIC, taxpayers will bail them out, and that's all the liabilities. JP Morgan and Jamie Dimon were saying, yeah man, bring us all the assets, you know what I mean? That was the craziest deal in history. And the only way they can do it, they pulled that off, no matter what, the Frankenstein Kool-Aid people want to share, put in your face. Actually, I'll bring that clip in a second, is if they control politicians, Federal Reserve, and the Treasury.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
we are concerned about the trouble and trend of irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 So not only has JP Morgan acquired all the assets of First Republic Bank, and basically the taxpayers will eventually have to pay for their liabilities of First Republic Bank, what if this continues? What if, let's say hypothetically in our example, JP Morgan acquires, Citi and Goldman Sachs, where 20% of the shares of the New York Federal Reserve owned by Citi and 20% of the shares of the New York Bank owned by Goldman Sachs gets acquired by JP Morgan. Now JP Morgan, for these two acquisitions, goes from 60% owner of the New York Federal Reserve to 100% owner of the Federal Reserve. So if what I'm saying is correct, why would the banksters allow the Fed, since they own the most, like Jamie Dimon, why would they allow the Fed to lose money? Are you sure the Fed isn't completely independent like they claim? Well, here's what I want to also share with you. So if JP Morgan owns the New York Fed, like in this example, and the Fed that we know is actually losing money, how is JP Morgan and Jamie Dimon actually allowing this to happen? Well, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve has two sides, has the assets and it has the liabilities. If the assets are, say, 3% growth year over year and the liabilities are 6%, because the liabilities are the deposits of JP Morgan. They're what they have at the Federal Reserve, and they have to incur that dividend, that interest of 6% that has to be paid to them. right? That's the liability. It's the deposits of JP Morgan that the Fed owes them, right? Year over year dividends. And the Fed can only generate 3% in growth or in assets every year. Then either way, JP Morgan is making 6%. So they're winning. They could care less. But if the other way happened where the assets are growing at 12% and the liabilities are less than 12, right, where the liabilities are weaker, where they're only at 6%, then the asset balances that are doing well for the Federal Reserve, because the shareholders are JP Morgan, their capital gains or their asset allocation, they're also winning, so they make profit. So JP Morgan wins either way. If the Federal Reserve does bad, they have interest-bearing bonds at the Federal Reserve, and if the Federal Reserve is winning, then the taxpayer loses, right? They're doing very well either way. That basically means with Jamie Dimon is probably sitting back, right, in his throne in his ivory tower thinking, heads I win, tails you lose. Now I want to actually get into a little bit of the secrets and reveal to you some of the details of the First Republic Bank that you might have missed if you only watched the mainstream media and how well JP Morgan did. Right? If we were to listen to the mainstream media on why JP Morgan, came and saved the day with First Republic Bank, and oh my God, they were the ones who sacrificed and took the most risk, blah, 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 blah. Actually, here's what they say also, right? They say, oh, the FDIC had to pay the least amount with JP Morgan bidding, and, they outcompeted Bank of America and all this other jazz, right?
The reason JP Morgan had emerged as the biggest bidder here and the most successful is because, as we know it, that the cost to the deposit insurance fund for the FDIC was the least under a JP Morgan acquisition.
Now, for those that, drink the Frankenstein Kool-Aid offered by the mainstream media, they'll want us to pray to Jamie Dimon like he's a savior of some sort, right? Like with some Superman complex, he came in to the rescue. So on the JP Morgan deal, right, the acquisition of First Republic Bank was sort of quarterbacked by the FDIC. The FDIC said, hey, listen, man, take some of these assets, and you know what? If some of these assets are toxic, let's just say they're office commercial real estates, we got your back. We will guarantee that those will do well and you will be covered on any losses that you may incur with your assets. So just please take these assets, right? These office commercial real estates. So essentially the FDIC is saying, hey, no matter what, you just have to sit back and worry about your profits. For real? So not only is the FDIC gonna be covering the losses of, the commercial real estate, the regular mortgages, the losses essentially of the acquisition of First Republic Bank, they're not only covering that, they're also opening a line of $50 billion, like a line of credit. That is crazy. That is ridiculous. You're also rewarding them. Not only are you telling them you have zero liabilities, don't worry about it, the taxpayers will end up doing that, you're also opening a $50 billion line, but the ridiculousness does not stop there. Ladies and gentlemen, JP Morgan's also expected to make $500 million gross, just guaranteed every year. That is ridiculous. Not only that, upon acquiring First Republic Bank, they made a profit right off the bat, just like an initial contract signing offer of $2.6 billion. And JP Morgan's like, oh my God, we gotta rebrand all of the First Republic banks and spend $2 billion. You just got a signing deal of $2.6 billion, and you're crying about a $2 billion facelift for the First Republic banks to have JP Morgan on them, with a $500 million basically interest on the profits of acquiring this, and a $50 billion line of credit, and you have no liabilities upon this acquisition that's going to be transferred to the bottom line, us, the people, the taxpayer. Jamie Dimon, seriously, man, how did you convince the FDIC that this was the best deal they can get? This is ridiculous. Obviously they're in your pocket. Obviously you know the treasuries and the Federal Reserve and the politicians. I'm sure you're greasing a lot of people with your lobbyists, but man, oh man, was that the best trade in history? And you're telling me the news media, the Frankenstein Kool-Aid dealers are telling you that that was the safest bet for the FDIC, guaranteeing the losses, opening a $50 billion line of credit? Are you mad? So wait, you're telling me, Mr. Mainstream media, you guys with your Frankenstein Kool-Aid that you're giving everybody, that there was no other bank willing to take a haircut from that initial signing contract of $2.6 billion? There was no bank out there willing to take for $1.6 billion or $2 billion or $1 billion initial signing contract, and no other bank was willing to take a haircut on the $500 million annually that JP Morgan was making right now to have what, $300 million rather than 500 or 200 million or 100 million? Are you telling me you couldn't find anybody? You couldn't tell me somebody, guys, would be like, okay, let me take some of this losses because I'll be making 300 million per year with a $2 billion signing contract? Are you mad? How is JP Morgan the best offer on the block? You really want us to think that we're just a bunch of ghouls in your ghoulish world drinking your Kool-Aid, man. This is complete absurdity. Jamie Dimon probably came out of his war room at JP Morgan, called up Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell and said, guys, we've looked at the books for First Republic Bank, and this is the game plan, right? We're gonna have the federal FDIC, right, have them pay up for all the liabilities and guarantee that none of the real estate or none of the liabilities will be put on us, and that will be covered by the taxpayers. So how much will that take from the FDIC? Our accountants say it'll take about 10% of the complete depository insurance of that just for this one bank, First Republic Bank. Not only will they lose 10% in the Federal Reserve, you guys can increase, we'll call Biden and tell him to run a bill to cover that FDIC by increasing taxes for the taxpayer. But anyway, that's the liability side. The asset side, what we're gonna do is, if we squeeze everything out of the system from First Republic Bank, we can get $500 million annually and $2.6 billion as a signing contract. Janet Yellen's like, $2.6 billion? I know nothing about economics, but maybe, sir, maybe, can I get a pinch of that? He's like, okay, here's a little bit for your family trust and your charities, okay? And Jerome Powell's like, oh man, this is gonna be tough, but okay, sir, we'll jump as high as you request. Not only will there be $2.6 billion and $500 million coming to us annually, we'll be the good guys. We'll be the ones who fund the rebranding of First Republic Bank into JP Morgan. We'll spend $2 billion and that will create jobs. Oh, you guys are so sweet and so nice. Oh, thank you for helping us, Jamie Dimon. And the absurdity does not stop there, ladies and gentlemen. We know the FDICs will be increasing their member banks charges. They'll go up, so banks will have to cough up more to fill that reserve. And the FDIC and banks don't like holding that hot potato. They'll pass it on to us, the public, the hard earners, the workers, the structure, the backbone, the middle class, the lower class, even the upper class, because you're not ain't super rich, you ain't in the billions, man. You're multi-million at best, you know what I mean? At best, you're, working hard, blood, sweat, and tears, contributing to the society, and these guys are saying, hey, we need to fill those coffers. We're gonna take a little bit of more fees over here, a little bit over there. That way we can transfer the hot potato because our earnings report needs it to be transferred to you, and we won't hold that back. So if you're not asking yourself, how is Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan getting away with this? It's because they own the politicians. It's because they own the treasury. It's because they also own the Federal Reserve, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why they're going to be quarterbacking the CBDC. And let's not forget that the global system that is dependent on all these banks, right, the global banksters, right, they have this SWIFT system where they all communicate with one another. And we have the Federal Reserve quarterbacking all central banks in this way as well, right? They're the head honcho. They're the ones who offer, oh, if you want to redeem your treasury bills, you come to us, kind of thing, right? So we have this global system of all these, supporting pillars. But guess what? After the 2008 crisis, the supporting pillars got knocked down. Let's say hypothetically there was 20 supporting pillars supporting the globe. After the financial crisis, boom, there goes 15. Now you're down to 5. After COVID, there's 4. Now we're down to 3, 2. How many supporting pillars have to go beneath your feet before you realize that, guys, this is unsustainable? We are not looking too well, we can't fly. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what we're getting at right now, right? We saw what happened during the great financial crisis of 2008, how many banks went busts. We're only in May, ladies and gentlemen, of 2023. and we're already exceeding that great financial crisis for bank failures in terms of dollar value. There's still 7 months ahead of us. We're not even in a war, but our deficits and our interest rates are at war-like levels. And since we're only in May, and generally speaking, in summertime, people are a little bit more positive, a little bit more euphoric, I expect the stock market will continue for the next 2 to 3 months until July, August, to continue pushing up, whether it's semiconductors or AI or whatever. Things are to be good. But then the second half of this year, that's when everything starts to take down. You know, by then what's happening in China will cross over, and all of a sudden everyone has to wear masks. All this stuff, banking crises will happen. You know, the GDPs will come back as, oh, this quarter we didn't do too well, unemployment have risen, and blah, 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 blah. If you watch my videos, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So we have only a few months left before the dominoes and the house of cards start, you know, let's say Humpty Dumpty. And even though Humpty Dumpty couldn't be put back together again, there's always JP Morgan grabbing all these regional banks up, you know, and FDIC's got all your deposits, you know, covered for the people. And you know what? Don't worry, JP Diamond or Citibank or Goldman Sachs, you take these deals, you not only make profit, the taxpayers will cover all the losses. We'll open a line of credit for you. You'll have annual income, and yes, you can save us all by giving a facelift to all these regional banks you just bought out and profited from, while the unemployment rates are going up. In my previous videos, I've mentioned that the regional banking crisis will continue to persist, even though there's a 25 basis points federal funds rate increase come June 14th. What will happen, whether the Federal Reserve increases that or pauses it, or there's a skip? If the banking crisis does continue and too big to fail banks come and sweep up those banks, what will happen is everything will become more centralized. And eventually, that's pretty much like a Hunger Games situation, right, ladies and gentlemen? It's like battle royale. The last one standing wins the pot. And as the bigger banks acquire the smaller banks, that increases their share of the Federal Reserve, right? Meaning they're actually in control of the Federal Reserve, and that's how these deals can come into play. And right now, we already know that the number one quarterback for all of these too big to fail banks is Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan, right? And JP Morgan has already research and development with the JPM coin. Now, Jamie Dimon has said that the JPM coin will have commercial application around the corner. And we know in July 1st is the FedNow. Oh, snap. Makes all sense though. It comes full circle. To review, if the New York Federal Reserve is mainly owned by JP Morgan, right, because of this Hunger Games battle royale style of too big to fail banks, last one standing, and then we have other Federal Reserves also being, you know, having their own Hunger Games with the other 12 districts, right? There's Bank of America, Citi, you name it, right? Each one of these 12, the 12 biggest to fail to banks, control their region. Now there's like a King Arthur and round table of big bankers, and they pretty much own the 12 regions of the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve is just offering a payment network, a payment rail, payment system, but not the actual dollar, just the rail. And these banks offer their own JPM coin and so and so and so and so. We can see how the CBDC can be integrated into society because of deals that they can offer that other banks won't be able to offer. Imagine going to JP Morgan or Bank of America or Citi and saying, hey man, your credit score was bad, but listen, we want to give you another chance. If you convert and accept the, you know, JPM coin, instead of you getting 6% on your line of credit, you'll get 5% on your line of credit. Oh my God, I get to borrow less? Yeah, you know what, the Federal Reserve having the interest rate so high, we might even do better for you if you bring in all your funds from Bank of America to here, JP Morgan. We'll give you 4% borrowing rate and 6% return on your deposits. You're gonna be flocking. You know what I mean? People are gonna be like, oh my God, this is an amazing deal. And this CBDC JPM coin will start to incentivize people from going there to their cash deposits of the traditional system into this new centralized ledger system of the banks. Now, none of this stuff plays out instantaneously, right? It takes time to move all of the big ships, right? It's like when you have a large cruise ship, to make a move, it takes some time to make a turn compared to a small speedboat. You know, you can make a you can make a turn on a dime. Same system, right? Where if you're trying to change the financial system slowly, that's going to take a little bit of time. That's why it might take place by the end of this decade. But the CBD system of JP Morgan coin or Bank of America coin or whatever coin will be on the rails of the FedNow, and this might happen in the future. So I just want to give you this heads up. That way we can prepare and protect our independence, our liberty, our freedom. Right? That's the most important, is to protect the future of our sovereignty as the people in our constitutional republic. To simplify the idea even further, right? Let's say that now that the New York Fed is 100% owned by JP Morgan because they're the last ones standing in this Hunger Games, right? That means a lot of the deposits that are held at JP Morgan, well, they'll have access to, right? They have it on their ledger, and we know most cash today is, you know, in digital form. Only about like 2% is in the physical form, and by the time cashless society comes around, it might be down to zero and might be 100% digital, right? So they will move everything from having systems in different ledgers everywhere to one centralized ledger. That's really what a CBDC is. It's just a ledger system, a centralized ledger, like the ultimate dream of communism, right? Everything's centralized and planned. And so if JP Morgan owns 100% of the depositors, that's basically a centralized ledger. It's JP Morgan Ledger, CBDC. But now they also own the most shares and 100% owner of the New York Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has to pay out that 6% dividend, right? So that's the Federal Reserve holds JP Morgan liabilities, and JP Morgan now holds the depositors' funds in there. That's quite beneficial for JP Morgan. Now you're probably thinking, Basil, in your hypothetical situation, your Hunger Game of big banks fighting it off, and eventually there being one last man standing, and now they own the New York Federal Reserve, JP Morgan coin is around the corner, but that doesn't mean we stop using the digital dollar. That's the fiat dollar. Now, how do you go from that to central bank digital currency? Well, let me show you an example of what happens when one central bank came up with their own ledger. Right? Essentially, the first CBDC in history. This happened back, like I said, in communism, right? This happens when there's central planning, but with banking, there's actually precedent on the planet. Let's go back to the first CBDC on the planet in 1922 in the USSR.
So we're here on Wikipedia, we're checking out Ghost Bank. Ghost Bank is the state bank of the USSR. It was also the central bank of the Soviet Union. It was the only bank in the entire country from 1992 to 1991. How crazy is that? Not too far away, it was the only bank, the central bank of the Soviet Union, modern day Russia. The Soviet state used Ghost Bank primarily as a tool to impose central control upon industry in general, using bank balances and transaction histories. Bank balances and transaction histories for control, that sounds like central planning, central financial planning, by using balances and transaction histories to monitor the activity of individual concerns and their compliance with 5-year plans and directives of the Soviet Union. That sounds like a lot like central planning using a financialized weapon, which is central bank digital currencies or central bank currencies. Right? There's only one. Ghost Bank did not act as a commercial bank. Right? It was a central bank, not a commercial bank, in regard to a profit motive. So it was non-profit. Sounds like the Federal Reserve. It acted theoretically as an instrument of government policy. Instead of independently and impartially assessing the credit worthiness of the borrower, so instead of doing impartiality in assessing the credit worthiness of the borrower, Ghost Bank would provide loan funds to favored individuals, groups, and industries as directed by the central government. Sounds like hand-me-downs from you-know-who to you-know-who. They don't care about your credit worthiness in this society of Ghost Bank centralized banking. in their version of using bank balances and transaction histories to monitor the activity. That sounds pretty much like the analog version of CBDCs. But instead of, computers early back in 1922, maybe they had it, I'm not quite sure. What they did have was paper and pages upon pages of bank balances and transaction histories, monitoring individuals, just like central bank digital currency. And history has shown anytime a central bank, right, has those capabilities, what do? They implement government policies. And when implementing government policies goes sour, instead of them impartially, independently assessing the creditworthiness of their borrowers, they would provide loan funds to favored individuals, groups, and industries as directed by the central government. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't the first time that we're talking about central banks' digital currencies. This has already happened. This is insane. We cannot let communism come into our reality. But Basil, Ghost Bank was a non-profit organization. Yeah, okay, so what? So what? It was a central bank that was using government policy for what? For favoring individuals and groups. They weaponized it, ladies and gentlemen. They weaponized it.
Yeah, they didn't have technology like we have today, but that's besides the point. The point is they had everyone in their bank on that one ledger. Yes, it was paper, right? It wasn't a blockchain, or it was paper chained, okay? It was book. It had one spine, and that ledger was owned in that bank, right? Yes, they were using stamps and pen with ink and everything else rather than ones and zeros on electricity. I get that, but it's the same. It rhymed, right, to what we're having today. So if we're not careful, right, that draconian, Orwellian, communistic state of mind will transfer over here, and it does not benefit the people. It benefits only the shareholders of that bank. That's Jamie Dimon and his familiars. So to avoid that draconian, ghoulish, Orwellian, every deposit's being on one ledger, we have to prevent ourselves from centralizing too much. We have to diversify our deposits and make sure we have a little bit of here, a little bit over there, and most of all, try to be your own bank. Try to memorize your own private keys and hold your own Bitcoin, or have something with you where you can start interacting and interfacing with the world. And trust me, as things start to develop with that draconian world, if you volunteer to join that style, then you sort of are putting that onto your great-grandchildren, right? Not even just great-grandchildren will be paying the price for that down the line. But if people start thinking and developing technology outside of that rail, that draconian, ghoulish rail, then guess what? We have to look for those innovative people, help them, and support them in order for us to unbank ourselves from that traditional world and start going into decentralizing our financing rather than following that centralized finance world. And that is the main point of all of this. It isn't so much of trying to avoid the CBDC, because there's so much negative publicity already about the word CBDC. The connotation, the mass marketers know this. You think Davos and these guys are gonna say, oh, we've come up with the CBDC, here we are? Bank of International Settlement, yeah, they have an icebreaker project for all of this stuff, but they're not going to call it a CBDC because of the negative connotations of people that are making production, like myself, have been bashing it for a while. They're not going to call it a CBDC. They're going to call it something else, but it's going to be backed on one centralized ledger. That is the point. Fiat is still made out of nothing. It's fugazi. The fact that everything is on one ledger, the assets and liabilities, everything on the balance sheet, they don't actually have to do much other than keep track of it all. Yes, they may witness the public blockchain of Bitcoin and other things, but they already control so much with a digital dollar. Who cares if they observe on a public ledger for Bitcoin? Because it's unconfiscatable. Yes, they can come and crash down your door and say, oh, you're funding illegal activities. If you're doing some crazy pedophile shit, bro, you should go to jail. You know what I mean? If you're doing some crazy stuff, whether using gold, silver, or the most common US dollar, then yes, you should go to jail. I'm not gonna advocate, nobody's gonna advocate for that. But what I'm saying is, if the masses do not prevent that tyrannical form by seducing us with better rates of return or better borrowing rates using this ledger system, right? Central bank ledgers, right? That is the main unravel that they're going to do. Whether it's Davos or Bank of International Settlements or the IMF with their SDRs, or even on a smaller national level in Canada or in Mexico or in Nigeria or in Ghana, it doesn't matter, bro. If it's in China or here, it's going to eventually come knocking on your door. You know what I mean? So we have to prevent it at its origin in the seed. We just spread the word and let them know, hey, central bank ledgers are the reason central bank digital currencies, it's digital. It's ones and zeros. It's a ledger. It's a currency because it's not money. Money is gold and silver certificates, paper money. It's gold and silver certificates. Currency is just energy. It's electrical, right? That's why the currency system has so many analogies with water. It's just energy. It's flow. We're working hard people that store our time and we get paid with cash, with currency. That's a battery, that's a capacitor saying, I want to release that charge and that money that I've worked for, in my paycheck, right? My income for the future. You're betting on that battery to be spending it for the future. Cash, currency is a battery. It's a capacitor of our blood, sweat, equity, our investment potential. So if that's deflated away by being printed away, or central bank ledgers get to manipulate the ledgers because everything's so centralized, then your freedom, your precious energy, whether it's physical or mental, will be depleted. These guys are vampires with a glass straw. So you don't see the straw, but you're like, man, I'm always tired. Things keep getting harder and harder, and it's hard to keep up with all of this stuff. Now I have to have 3 people working in my house. Now I have 2 families living in the same home. You know what I mean? That's crazy what people are doing because they don't see there's a freaking glass straw in their neck with these central bankers and the system of centralized ledger where they get to control how much is in our currency. Nothing has a max cap. You know what I mean? They're inflating and printing and debasing everything. And in history, we see that is the worst way for a nation to continue to prosper. Debasing is the peak of where you start coming down. When you start considering debasing your currency as a nation or an empire, just a matter of time where it declines. Yes, it might not happen with your lifetime or my lifetime, but guess what, man? That's not far away. A couple decades from now, it's not far away. It is absolutely crucial we use our critical thinking to keep and, in fact, maybe even grow, because we might have lost some. But it's imperative that we continue to grow and seize our freedom, our privacy, our right to choose and protect what we love. And that's why we have to stay away from centrally planned ledgers or whatever they want to spit it out. We'll use a critical thinking. We'll isolate that. Like, no, thank you. I know you're offering a sweet deal, but that shiny apple is rotten inside. If you made it to the end, I want to thank you. I wish I can give you a like for being such a person investing in yourself. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to continue to build this future that we will be building together here at the Financial Almanac. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Peace!